Good afternoon and welcome to Free West Media YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so. And this afternoon or morning in America, I'm fortunate to be talking to retired Colonel Chris Wyatt. And we're going to talk about farm murders and police statistics. South African farm murders, that is. Good morning to you, Chris.
Well, Dan, good afternoon to you. It's always funny because you're ahead of me there, so I'm calling from the past. But good afternoon to you. It's a pleasure to be back with you once again.
Yes, me too. Likewise. Yes, so the whole issue of farm murders has been a hot topic of discussion in South Africa for years now, and there are all kinds of conflicts about or disagreements about the statistics and whether farm murders are as huge a problem as some people seem to think it is. And there's also been a paucity, really, of research on the issue. Here and there, people have put out papers on it, but it's given the huge impact that it has on South Africa, I don't think enough is being done to actually shed light on this topic. Well, what do you feel about that?
Well, I agree that the problem with this is statistics and the way that they're compiled and the information, the way it's put available. So an awful lot's been happening over the years, and some of us have been reporting it and saying that the way that the police capture statistics is inaccurate. But it's becoming increasingly clear to me that it's not simply a mistake, it's intentional. And why I say intentional, it's clear to me that the government is trying to suppress the information and deny what's actually happening on farms. They come up with all kinds of ludicrous arguments all the time. And the case in point that comes to mind is a dear friend of mine's mother was assaulted and her partner were assaulted on a farm near Brits last week, savagely beaten. The gentleman was wheelchair bound in his late 70s, if I'm not mistaken. It might be his early 80s, I think his late 70s. Wheelchair bound because he had a recent hip operation. They restrained them, tied their hands up, and then savagely beat them with an iron. And these weren't Mozambicans or Congolese or Nigerians, which is what the government will always try to claim them. They were Setswana speakers. They spoke Setswana fluently. The farmer asked, please don't murder us or rape my wife. Well, they didn't murder his wife or rape his wife, but in the end, he died from the grievous wounds that he suffered in that savage attack just a couple nights ago, less than a week after he was assaulted. What a horrific way to end your life after living for decades, having someone break in your home. And this is one of the situations where it's obvious that the police are hiding the statistics. And then the minister for police, Senza Mkunu, says that, well, there's only been one farm murder. Well, that's a lie. And then he said, well, there's been more black folks murdered on farms. Yeah, there's a lot of black farmers and people who are farm workers, managers that are murdered on farms, and it doesn't get reported by the press because it's not sexy and it doesn't help them advance their argument about a white genocide, which they're using to beat up the white population, falsely claiming that whites are using this term when it's the media and politicians using it to rubbish what's going on, which is ironic. But this was reported as a house robbery. At a minimum, what occurred in that evening was domestic terrorism, aggravated assault with the intent to kill, attempted murder, home invasion, trespassing, but it's simply listed as a house robbery. They took a television and one or two other small items, and then the police were able to say, hey, it was a robbery, instead of reporting what the crime actually was. Now the gentleman has died, and I have South Africans, white South Africans, Afrikaners, going on Facebook, calling me a liar, questioning my credibility. These are people whom I know personally. And the argument, this is the nonsense that happens in South Africa. It's not just the government, it's also South Africans that cover this up. This gentleman said, oh, well, my contacts in Brits don't know anything about this. Well, maybe that's because I broke the story globally because my friend was affected and I got their permission to tell the story as soon as it came out, before it was even, it's never been covered in the press in South Africa. So the fact that some South African doesn't have contacts in Brits that know what's going on doesn't mean it didn't happen. And for idiots like this to question my credibility and deny it. And I'll tell you what's going to happen now very quickly here, Dan. What's going to happen is that he died nearly a week after being assaulted. They're going to claim that the assault wasn't the cause of death. But if they hadn't broken in the home and assaulted this elderly man who was wheelchair bound and cowardly whipped him with an antique iron that weighs several kilos, he would not be dead today. That is the proximate cause of the man's death. That is a farm murder, and it's been listed as a house robbery in Brits, not a murder.
Yes, I've also heard that one that if they try to cover up these statistics just classifying the crime as a lesser offense, although they are supposed to use the most serious offense during the event, if it's like murder or rape or something like that, to classify the offense. But as you say, if he dies a week later, then there's supposedly no causal link between the two incidences, the assault and his actual death from his wounds a week later, which is absolutely scandalous. And that's why we looking through this opaque prism at this problem. But I've just, glanced at, I think I told you about that as well. In 2007, there was a master's degree dissertation with a long title about the victimological investigation of farm attacks and so on, by somebody called Veronica Hornschuh, which although it's a fairly dated study, it's almost 20 years old now, it does provide some insight into what's going on. And this thing that struck me, I also looked at the section on the modus operandi of these farm attackers. And then there's definitely a whole lot of planning that goes onto it. There's a reconnaissance, and then there's an operational event during the attack, and then there's a getaway afterwards. So they're almost, military-style attacks that take place against farmers. And all of this really started around, according to her, started around 1993. Before then, I mean, historically, there were some isolated, even from the beginning, from 1652 onwards, there were isolated events or incidences where people were attacked on farms, but it wasn't as generalized as it is today. So there's definitely something going on. And, what motivates these farm attackers is what the whole debate is about. And I don't think the kind of rhetoric from, people like Julius Malema, kill a boer, kill a farmer, is helping the situation at all.
Well, in fact, you have a good point. That's a fantastic master's thesis. I read through it. I'm aware of the modus operandi. I've been reporting on that inside the intelligence community for years, and now as a private citizen, openly and publicly reporting on it. I'll get to that in a second. But what I liked about that master's thesis is that it addresses farm attacks in a holistic approach and goes all the way back to the beginning of European settlement in the Western Cape, talking about the history of this sort of thing, which is fascinating and very informative. And very few people have ever done that. In fact, I haven't gone back and looked at, farm attacks before the formation of the Boer republics. That's not something I looked at. I looked at, as a historian, I've looked at events back there, but I didn't look at it in that context. So it's a very informative paper from that standpoint. And thank you for pointing it out to me. I've gone through it and looked at a number of things. As far as the modus operandi, so the problem with farm attacks is that the government lies about it, politicians lie about it because they live in plush Gucci residences with blue light escorts everywhere and fancy restaurants. And they're so disconnected from reality, and they're so full of themselves that they don't have any compassion for what's going on here. So let's knock out a few points about this. Farm attacks occur. Black, white, colored, and Indian South Africans are the victims of these crimes. However, whites in particular are especially targeted. And the argument for the government has often been, well, this is revenge for abusive farm workers. Well, that's nonsense. That may account for an odd attack here and there, but it doesn't account for the execution style, the tortures, the dismemberments, the rapes. I mean, it's sickening and horrifying, the things that have happened to people. We had the instance where a family came home from the evening celebrating their anniversary, I believe it was, a young couple with their small child, 2 years old. And they came up and they sliced open with a panga the man's artery under his arm. He was mortally wounded. And then they took the wife into the house, but the daughter was crying. So they took the child over to the bushes and shot a 2-year-old child in the head, execute the child. Now, this isn't robbery. If the child's annoying, just leave it there and let it cry, And why did you have to murder the man to rob him? And then the torture that goes on, the dismemberment, it's unbelievable. We have video footage from closed circuit televisions of people wearing police issued firearms, carrying cell phone jammers, and also having wire cutters breaking into farms. And this is from several years ago. This is a very disturbing situation. Many of these attacks are, in my view, organized by syndicates that are trying to achieve something specifically. And I'm not going to make an allegation who's behind them, but we could have all kinds of supposition about who could be behind this. Every time a small farmer in South Africa is chased off their land, that land becomes available. Someone buys it. Gee, I wonder what happens to that land, or it goes fallow. To me, some of this is clearly domestic terrorism. It's meant to intimidate, frighten people off the land because there's no other purpose to doing it, no other reason for doing it. And the people doing this are getting away with a horrific crime against humanity because the government's callous indifference. They constantly talk about priority crimes, but they don't make rural crimes a priority crime. They've disbanded the commandos almost 20 years ago now under the spurious claim that they were a racist organization, which was comical given that the most recent regiments added to the commandos were entirely Zulu and black. And they were the only form of formal employment for those in those regiments. Now, the commandos wasn't a perfect solution. It was a reserve force that served as a deterrence, and it helped keep some of this crime down because people know they could respond. But now there's nothing. The police aren't equipped, and even if they are equipped, they're callous and don't care. I mean, the stories, Dan, that I've heard from South Africans and the evidence that I've seen from South Africans over the years is horrific. Crimes, people just beaten senseless, murdered, and it's just look, it's orchestrated, it's planned. And let me just elaborate very quickly before I finish here. On the attack that occurred in Brits, a few nights before the attack, they poisoned their dogs. So now they have no alert. They have no alert system. The dogs were their system to alert them that someone's on the farm. Then the next night, they stole the wheels off their bakkie so they couldn't escape. Now, why would you steal the wheels off the bakkie? Why wouldn't you steal the bakkie? Right? Okay. And then the next night at 2 a.m., they broke into their home. 5 armed thugs who spoke fluent Setswana with a South African accent, or maybe it was a Botswana accent. I can't attest to that. I wasn't there. I'm just relaying what I was told. And then they tie up a wheelchair-bound man and beat him senseless. Why? Why? Tie him up, rob the place, and leave. Case closed. If you were trying to prevent a witness from testifying against you, they would have murdered him right there on the spot. But they didn't. They left him to die. He was restrained from after 2 o'clock in the morning until he broke free of his restraints at 11 a.m. and then crawled over and untied her, and she ran to a neighboring farm. Who must suffer such horrific terroristic assaults? But the government doesn't care. And to me, it's intentional.
Yes, well, you're probably familiar with the phrase from Mao Zedong, kill one, scare 1,000. I think these 4 murders seem to me to be part of an intimidation campaign to actually scare people off the land so that the state can come in and buy up all the land. The state's ownership of land is growing all the time. It already owns huge tracts of land, but it seems to want more. And it wants the land at lower and lower prices. But there is the sadistic element to it, which is very hard to explain. But I think there also seems to be some occult element involved in a lot of these farm attacks, and in this woman's master's dissertation, she also touches on that, the fact that they do consult with these sangomas and witch doctors beforehand to kind of bless their attack or their operation, and could be that some of the cruelty that's involved could be related to these kind of supernatural beliefs that a lot of these farm attackers seem to have. Have you come across that?
No, I really haven't. That's not something I focus on. The bigger focus for me is the operational security aspect of it, the actual physical security and how these are happening. A lot of these places are marked. There are specific coding markings that are put. The same with residential robberies and carjackings. People will mark at the gate, to signal when, the attack should occur, or this is the place to come after people. And that seemed to happen on farms. I'm not aware of the occult stuff. I've heard people talk about it, but I've not really investigated to any degree. To me, this is an indication of an illegitimate government. The prima facie purpose for having a government, a polity, the body politic, we come together to create governments. Now, we've all inherited our current governments. I wasn't around 1776 to come up with mine, but we've all inherited our existing governments in many respects, although many South Africans played a role in your current governance. But most people inherit their governance. And the role of government is to protect our common interests. It's to provide a level playing field that so nobody takes advantage of others with a court system and a deterrence and arrest and policing system. And it's also there to ensure that the public is safe from internal and external threats. And when the government callously ignores and disregards the threat to South Africans because of their skin color, to me, they lose their legitimacy. That's not a legitimate government. When you're ignoring people's plight because of their skin color, whether you're an apartheid government or an ANC government, you're not legitimate.
Yes, I've just had a discussion with some academic research guy recently, and I mean the one point that he made was that the previous government, even though it had legislation on the books that could be considered racially discriminatory, it never called for the assassination, the killing, the prejudice of people of color or anything of the kind. Whereas, we've seen a lot of these radical politicians like Malema, and even while he was in the ANC, he was singing "Kill the Boer" and all that sort of thing. And the court system also being very tolerant towards that. And in fact, they've authorized the singing of this song. So South Africa has really moved along the path of ethnic conflict, and farm murders is one of the areas where it comes to the fore. And I think if the politicians could be more responsible, then perhaps we could see some end to this scourge along the road. But for the moment, it seems that it's going to be with us forever. This week, only the past week or so, I saw in reports in the Afrikaans media of two such incidents. I don't know if the one in Brits was one of them, but there was an elderly man of about 80 years old and another man who was also killed. So we had two farm murders in 1 week. And not really very well covered in the mainstream media at all.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if the attack in Brits was ever covered in the mainstream media. Maybe it was covered by Netwerk 24, but it wasn't covered in the English-speaking.
Yes.
Of course, I didn't see it in IOL, News 24, Daily Maverick, the Mail and Guardian. None of them carried it. Newsroom Africa. None of these organizations covered that story, to my knowledge. It's so. The government today doesn't have a policy trying to say, attack or kill people based on ethnicity, but the government does tolerate. And of course, the answer here we'll get is, and we heard it from Cyril Ramaphosa after he lied to President Trump. He said, "I disavow what Julius Malema says." But of course, it was Cyril Ramaphosa just a few years ago, after knowing that he's been singing this song for years, said, "We welcome Julius Malema and the EFF back into the ANC. It's their natural home. They should come home to the." So he lied to President Trump, saying he disavowed that. And then he goes back and says, "We're not going to arrest anybody because it's free speech. We have freedom of speech." Well, free speech involves, excuse me, well, I've got phone calls coming left and right here. My phone's blowing up. Free speech is not unlimited. You have to have responsible speech. You cannot go in a theater and shout fire and lead a panic that leads to the deaths of people. That's not free speech. That's a crime. You cannot run around and exhort people to commit murder. That is inciting violence. That is domestic terrorism. And the government tolerates this. Now, the irony with all this, Dan, is that in 2003, the South African courts declared "Kill the Boer" hate speech and criminal, and you could not sing it. People have forgotten that. You can read the New York Times. They cover the story in 2003 that was declared hate speech. And what's so frustrating about this is that while we hear this empathy, and people should have empathy for the feelings of others, we hear that the reason why the Union flag, which is a flag created for the reconciliation of the Boer and the English after the Anglo-Boer War with the Union of South Africa Act, that flag was created in the aftermath of that to unite these former Boer republics and British colonies in one country under white rule, but united country. We're told that that's a symbol of hate, that it brings grievous pain to Black South Africans. I'm sorry, I guess white South Africans just dance for joy and do a jig every time, do a little Cowfoot Soki every time they hear "Kill the Boer." Seriously? How is that not harmful to people, whether it leads to violence or not? We are told that the Union flag is a symbol of hate and it's banned in South Africa because it hurts people's feelings. Whether or not "Kill the Boer" leads to deaths of white South African farmers or not shouldn't be germane. If that's the argument for banning the flag by a cowardly government that bans speech, Why are they allowing someone to still sing violent songs that incite people to kill people? Do you see the hypocrisy here? I'm sure you do.
Yes, I do. And in fact, it's not on this channel, it's on my other Afrikaans channel, but I should actually post it here as well. I actually went out on the streets and in shopping centers and so on, and I had that was shortly after the flag had been banned, and I had a copy of it, a sort of an A4 sized copy of the flag, because I mean, theoretically, they could even arrest me for carrying it around in public like that. But then, and I asked people in the street what they thought about the flag, and there was not one person I spoke to on the street and in shopping centers, and mostly black people too, who felt offended by the flag and who felt that it should be banned. I mean, it was completely, a kind of orchestrated thing from the government and the so-called Human Rights Commission that banned the flag. There was no public support behind it whatsoever, and the so-called offensive nature of the flag. I mean, it's a figment of their imagination. Honestly, I mean that
Absolutely.
flag's been us for, and it comes from a Dutch flag that dates from 1572.
Yeah.
Now, how on earth can, a flag that's hundreds of years old actually offend people suddenly in this day and age to such an extent that it should be banned as hate speech? I mean, even just the notion of declaring a flag and a few colors on cloth to be hate speech, I mean, that in itself seems to me completely outlandish. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I agree 100%. I actually, without knowing it, actually committed crimes, although they weren't really crimes because it didn't affect me. I had a status force agreement, but I had a copy of Mein Kampf that I read when I was stationed in Germany. And as a young soldier, I was reading it because I was in Germany. It was apropos, only to find out that it was illegal to
Mm.
have that book in Germany. Now, not for me because we were exempt U.S. military status forces, but I mean, when you ban things like that, when you ban Nazi symbols, all you do is make them more mysterious and make more people interested in them and curious about them. Most people pay no attention to it. When a government censors speech, they're illegitimate. It's really unfortunate, but censoring speech is not charging someone with a crime for inciting violence. It's a very different situation. It's this whole situation is really sad. What is going on here, Dan, and has been going on for 30 years, is that elements of the African National Congress are nothing but serious racists who hate white people and want to eliminate them from South Africa and will make every pretense to remove European culture, European settlement, and the history of South Africa. And a perfect example of this is that the renaming campaign. Why is Pretoria named after Andreas Pretorius, renamed Tshwane, the metropolitan area? For a mystical Tswana chief, and nothing against the Tswana. I love the Tswana people. I came Botswana. I used to live in Botswana, and I promote said Tswana all the time and that culture. But naming after mystical chief, he didn't found a settlement there. There was no settlement at Pretoria until the Voortrekkers arrived there and started building a town. There was no settlement in Nelspruit until white Europeans, South Africans at this stage, started a settlement there in the 19th century and built a town. These are towns that were built by Europeans. And yes, there were black folks that were in construction, all that, but that's not the point. If you want to create a town and honor someone like Mandelaville or Nelson Mandela Bay, build a town, build a purpose-built town and name it today. You don't steal the cultural identity of people and wipe them out. It's no different than what Europeans and the Bantu did to the Khoi and San peoples, trying to exterminate them and push them to the margins and into the Kalahari. This is what's happening to white South Africans, and it's intentional by elements of the ANC, members of the National Executive Committee. Not all of them, but members of them who hold enough power and influence that they've gotten away with this. There is a cultural genocide against Afrikaans. Not allowing students to speak Afrikaans at Stellenbosch, the premier Afrikaans university on the planet, the university where the land was granted into perpetuity on the basis that the medium of instruction would always be Afrikaans, and these people are being ostracized because they speak Afrikaans at Stellies? Give me a break. This is an intentional effort to eliminate white Europeans, those South Africans of white European origin from South Africa. There could be another conclusion. Now, it's not most of South Africa. Most South Africans are wonderful people, black, white, and brown. But politically powerful people are getting away with this. And the world just sits around and watches it, says nothing.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. I also can't stand these name changes. There's a street here near where I live that was called William Nicol. It's just about the longest
Now
street in Johannesburg.
Winnie Mandela now.
Yes, and I mean, she also supported this whole killer boer, killer farmer slogan, and she was found guilty of what you in the US would call felonies of crimes. I mean, she had committed fraud for which
Yep.
she was found guilty by the court, and she was also involved in the whole murder of that 11-year-old child
Stumpy.
Stompy
Stumpy,
Spay.
yes.
Now, how on earth can you name a street after somebody like that? And William Nicol himself was a very good man. He was a minister of religion, but he was also a former administrator of the Transvaal. He gave offense to no one, no language group, no racial group. He
Yep.
actually helped to translate the Bible into some of the African languages. And he was just an all-round good person. And why would you take his name off the street to replace it with that of Winnie Mandela? It's simply beyond me.
Well, it's all part of the same campaign here, and it's also the false grievances, the falsely aggrieved. So let's go back to Balk van Vlerik about 20 years ago when he recorded a song De La Rey, and racist black South Africans lost their minds and said that white supremacists are singing this song. The lyrics have nothing to do with white supremacy. The lyrics have everything to do with the post 1994 Afrikaner people in search of someone in their community who is a leader to step forward and say, hey, this is where our community is going. Because De La Rey was that leader during the Anglo-Boer War. He was the guy who stepped forward and unfortunately was killed when they thought he was a gang, part of a bank robbery gang, unfortunately, at the beginning of the First World War. But De La Rey, that song is about uniting a people, and it's against the English, not against black Africans. It has nothing to do with black Africans other than the fact that they were also thrown into concentration camps by the English, and many of them died there as well because they fought alongside the Boers. And so people lost their minds over that song. For what? For what? There's nothing wrong with that song. That song has nothing to do, it's not racist, it's not against black South Africans. It's a consequence of racists in the ruling party who are terrified of white people because they're inferior little pukes. There, I said it.
Yes. But something else happened to me a few days ago. I found I think on Facebook or somewhere, I found an old black and white photograph of Hillbrow, a street scene in Hillbrow. It was probably Pretoria Street in Hillbrow. And I put that on, on X. I posted it on X and I said, this is what Hillbrow looked like in the late 1970s. And everybody knows what it looks like today. I mean, it's an utter slum and, there are piles of garbage on the sidewalks, the height of a man. And the place is completely falling apart. And I got I got so much hate mail about that. It was just incredible. That scene itself was equated to apartheid, and how dare I show it on X, and that revealed that I was a racist and so on. I mean, it's incredible how touchy people are about even a black and white photograph of a street scene showing a few people sitting at a street cafe having coffee, and showing a few old cars from the 1970 models cars.
No, it's all about, Dan, it's all about false grievance. It's all about false grievance to divide South Africans. And, the term racist is like using the F word in English. It has no currency anymore. It's been so misused. A racist definition of racism in my book has always been someone that believes one group of people is more or superior to another group and one group is inferior to another group. And then they take action based on that, either conferring advantage or disadvantage on the other group based on that. That's racism to me. And that's exactly what the ANC government has been for the past 30 years. All these racist laws. And we hear these idiots run around going, well, it's not racist because it also deals with disabled and with women. Well, women come in all colors, and so it's not germane. And disabled people come in all colors, and they're a tiny fraction of the population. But when you create labor laws that say that only 4% of your upper management can be white males, that's racism. It should be based on merit. And if it's only 2% of the best managers, then it's only 2%. But if it's 25%, then it's 25%. And then you need to look at why is it systemically a problem? Why are more white males rising to levels of more competency? Could it be the fatherless families and the lack of concern for education and the lower educational standards and all the social ills that we have in communities? Maybe that's the problem.
Well, one of you probably know who Dirk Herman is. He's the head of the trade union movement,
Solidarity.
Solidariteit in Afrikaans. And he wrote another book in Afrikaans, which I haven't read. I think it's called, affirmative action in Afrikaans is herstellende aksie, which is a too neutral a term for me. But yeah, at any rate, right, he wrote a book with the title herstellende trane as an affirmative tears, you could translate it. And somebody told me about one incident he records in that book that, the supermarket chain Woolworths, I mean, their affirmative action program was so successful they had too few whites left in the company, and their racial, quotas were way over on the black side. So they had to correct that. And the only way, but they couldn't obviously.
They couldn't fire the black folks, so they had to create new positions, and they became less profitable.
Yes, but they also couldn't advertise for white people to join the company
because they would have been attacked.
They would have been attacked. So they had to advertise for, just any, they didn't say it was affirmative action or anything like that. It was just a normal ad for people. But knowing full well that they were going to employ the white people because they now had a deficiency of white people in the company. That's just an example of the absurdities to which these laws lend themselves.
Well, it is absurdity. A couple of years ago, the netball semifinal, this team won an amazing victory. And then a few moments after the victory, they're all jumping and celebrating on the court because they're going to the final. And bear in mind that netball is a way that young ladies can make a living in England, in Australia. They actually go and play in professional leagues and can make money. So if they go to a final and they impress scouts, they could have a career at least, and make a little bit of money for a few years. And what happened was the whistle blew. A couple moments later, the officials came over and they negated the win. And everyone's like, what do you mean? What did we do? We didn't cheat. Yeah, well, you didn't have enough white players on the court. What? So there was a requirement to have, I think, at least 2 white players or something like that playing on the netball court at the same time. And a white player was injured, and the only player available was a black player. So that black player went in and played like just a minute or 2 longer than they're allowed to play and exceeded the cap of having too many black players on the team. Now, how ridiculous is this? This is the absurdity of these stupid rules. And so they forfeited the game. I mean, that's ridiculous beyond belief. Just let the best people play. Let the best people play. And if there's a systemic problem where a group of people, whether they're coloreds or whites or Indians or blacks, are not achieving, look at it holistically. We found the problem. These schools are only getting 40% of the funding they need. So we need to put more money in the academic programs and in the sports programs. There you go. Solve the problem. But no, in South Africa, we dumb down the standards and lower the scores to 30%, and 40% in your first language, and then tell people they've actually graduated from high school and completed matriculation. Now they're matric and they go on to university or go in the job market, but they're functionally illiterate. They can't function in society, and they have expectations and a culture of entitlement. I can't find a job, but I've gone through matric. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. Meanwhile, we've got kids with a 98% score on matric who are Afrikaans speaking denied access to UCT because they're white. This is ridiculous. It doesn't help anybody. It holds everybody back. Fix the broken areas and treat everybody the same, and we'll all do better. Dr. Martin Luther King said it well. The content of one's character, not the color of their skin. And that's what should matter.
Yeah, you're quite right. And I also read about that netball incident. And of course, there have been many like that, where teams forfeited their wins because they didn't have the right racial quota on the field at the time. But yes, it's been interesting talking to you, Chris. I think we're running out of time now. And thanks again for the conversation, and to the viewers. If you've watched up to this point, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And next time we'll see you again.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Cheers.
Goodbye, Chris.